Hello, everyone. This is Admiral Jamie Foggo from the Center for Maritime Strategy at the Navy League of the United States, just outside Washington, D.C. You're listening to Maritime Nation, the Center for Maritime Strategy's podcast designed to dive deeply into policy challenges facing America's sea services and the role of the United States as a sea power on the global stage. Welcome back to the third season of Maritime Nation. This season is produced with the support from Dataminr. Dataminr is recognized as one of the world's leading AI businesses. The company's clients are the first to know about high-impact events, emerging risks, so they can mitigate and manage crises more effectively. Dataminr solutions are relied on 24/7 by hundreds of clients in over 100 countries across 6 continents to help them solve real-world problems. While in uniform, I relied on Dataminr First Alert for situational awareness with the ever-expanding public available information space. Now, today, I'm delighted to be joined by Professor Brenda Shaffer. Professor, welcome.
Thank you.
Professor Brenda Shaffer is an international energy and foreign policy specialist focusing on natural gas trade and foreign policy, Caspian energy, Azerbaijan, Iranian energy sector, energy security policies, European energy security, critical energy infrastructure protection policy, and Eastern Mediterranean energy. She is a faculty member of the U.S. Naval Postgraduate School. Professor Shaffer is also a senior advisor for energy at the Foundation for Defense of Democracies, FDD, a think tank, and she is a senior fellow at the Atlantic Council's Global Energy Center in Washington, D.C. Professor Shaffer is the author of several books, Operational Energy, and we got a copy of the ebook, and I have the manuscript right here. I'm going to hold it up for everybody. Co-authored with Daniel Nussbaum and Alan Howard by De Gruyter Press in 2024. Iran is More Than Persia, Ethnic Politics in Iran, De Gruyter 2022. Energy Politics, I have a copy of that book with me here, from the University of Pennsylvania Press, 2009. Borders and Brethren, Iran and the Challenge of Azerbaijan Identity, MIT Press, 2002. Partners in Need, the Strategic Relationship of Russia and Iran, Washington Institute for Near East Policy, 2001. Professor Shaffer has also served as the editor of Beyond the Resource Curse, University of Pennsylvania Press, 2012, and Limits of Culture, Islam and Foreign Policy, MIT Press, 2006. Wow, that's a lot of
old.
That's a lot of writing, and that's a lot of work. Now, Professor Shaffer frequently provides research and expert counsel to international institutions, governments, energy companies, financial institutions, and regional security organizations. Shaffer has served as an advisor to Israel's Prime Minister's Office and Ministry of Energy on policy related to the major natural gas discoveries in Israel. She has advised several companies involved in Caspian energy production and export. She has given testimony to several committees of the U.S. Congress, including the Senate Foreign Relations Committee and to the European Parliament. Brenda frequently appears on major news outlets worldwide to provide insight on developments in global energy markets and trends. Boy, thanks for doing Maritime Nation, Professor Shaffer. And you are broadcasting from overseas. Today, I believe you're in Tel Aviv. Is that correct?
That's correct.
Wow. Well, before we dive in, and may I call you Brenda?
Of course.
All right.
Of course.
Yeah, Brenda and Jamie, that's great. Before we dive in, it's our tradition to kick off each episode of Maritime Nation with a featured term from the Naval Terms Dictionary, my plebe edition from 1977 from the Naval Academy. And for this episode on energy, I thought, well, I'll look up what it says about the term nuclear power. And curiously enough, it didn't have an entry on nuclear power, but it had an entry on the nuclear-powered guided missile cruiser. The first nuclear surface combatant, the USS Long Beach, was the only missile cruiser built from the keel up. Her main battery consisted of Talos, Terrier, and Azeroth launchers. She had no guns in the original design, but 2 5-inch mounts were added after construction. The primary function was to be in a nuclear task force built around a CVAN. All this is in the definition. When I saw CVAN, I hadn't seen that term for probably 40 years. CVAN refers to a specific designation of CV, an aircraft carrier, and given to a nuclear-powered attack aircraft carrier, a designation that's not in the inventory anymore. Today, we just use the term CVN for nuclear-powered carriers, Nimitz class and Ford class. The Ford class, our latest class, is 100,000 tons of diplomacy. So, Dr. Shaffer, as you might agree, there's a lot of politics surrounding nuclear power. And when operated correctly, nuclear power plants are a tremendous source of clean energy we might talk about today. Now, there's been a few accidents like 3 Mile Island and Chernobyl, which have set the industry back, but the U.S. Navy has safely operated its reactors since 1954, and our nuclear Navy is a tremendous force multiplier. Even so, there are critics out there. And just a couple of weeks ago, a friend of mine, Dr. Harlan Ullman of the Kilowan Group, published a piece entitled, Is it time to deep six nuclear power in the U.S. Navy? Now, I've known Dr. Ullman for a long time. He's intelligent and he's highly prolific. And needless to say, I saw a lot of email traffic on his essay, and I have to say that Dr. Ullman achieved his goal and that he got the juices flowing and the conversation going, particularly in the nuclear Navy. His main point is that we can't afford nuclear power warships with escalating costs. Now, I will give him the point that there are escalating costs in the shipbuilding industry in the United States, and we've got to get that under control. But I will agree to disagree with Dr. Ullman. I just published my own piece in the Mock earlier this month with the title, What If There Were No More Carriers? So here's the bottom line up front, folks. Yes, Dr. Ullman, freedom is expensive. We have 11 nuclear-powered aircraft carriers with a goal of 12 by the 2040s. These 11 carriers are performing the job of 15 carriers because they're always at sea, and they're often extended on deployment, just like the Eisenhower, just like the Ford, 2 9-month deployments. When a crisis happens, the first thing the commander-in-chief asks is, where are the carriers? Nuclear power offers the president options because of the speed, flexibility, dwell, and firepower delivered by the platforms, carriers or submarines, nuclear-powered. Furthermore, the agility and speed of the platforms allow the combatant commanders to respond quickly to crisis. Some folks don't know that the last 2 carriers in the Arabian Gulf really weren't supposed to be there. USS Abraham Lincoln and USS Theodore Roosevelt responded to the continuing crisis in the Middle East from the Pacific theater of operations. One came from San Diego, the other one was in Guam. Now, that's what I call the epitome of distributed maritime operations, or DMO, the Navy's current doctrinal approach to getting more bang for the buck from a smaller force. And make no mistake, we want a larger force. Okay. Enough said on nuclear power. Thanks for indulging me, Brenda. By the way, any comments from you on the attributes of nuclear power and a nuclear Navy?
Sure. So first thing, I think nuclear energy and nuclear energy in the military use is an important example of the interconnection between military innovation and energy innovation. Because most energy transitions, when we've gone from one major energy source, dominant fuel source, to another, the military innovation has either played a big role as a catalyst or has been a big benefactor. So, for instance, at the beginning of the 20th century, petroleum-based fuels became very prominent in transportation, whether it was cars and trucks, were taking over, animal transportation. And soon in World War I, we saw jet fuel and trucks and cars, being used in the battle space. So there was a really clear connection. The same, we have during World War II. We developed use of nuclear energy for warfare, and nuclear energy. Actually, even a decommissioned submarine nuclear reactor was used for the first nuclear energy plant in the United States in Pennsylvania. So one, there's this really important interconnection. Second, when it comes to what we call operational energy for military uses, you see how essentially the nuclear fleets in the U.S. military are in a completely different category than the rest of the military, because the rest of the military has to constantly think out how to provide military energy to its forces in a clever and strategic way, and how to disrupt energy supplies to the enemy. Where our nuclear force, basically, you have that taken care of. I mean, you don't need to, on a constant basis, to think about how you're going to fuel your fleet. So it's in a completely different category than the rest of the military in terms of its lack of dependence, sort of day-to-day dependence on an energy source. I think also nuclear, most think that the reason that nuclear energy capacity is, at least in the West, it's declining, is because of safety. But the real reason is because of cost. It's simply more expensive to produce electricity by nuclear than it is from coal or natural gas. But when you compare it with renewables, which are more expensive, then nuclear, if the carbon issue is an important part of your policy, then nuclear is much more competitive. So I think there will be a new look at nuclear energy because of the interest in a low carbon source. I think also, to say how just an illustration of, I think your introduction was very good about those carriers were in the Pacific and suddenly they're in the Middle East, and really probably no other type of military vehicle could do that except, a nuclear powered one. We've had successive administrations, U.S. administrations, that talk about the pivot to Asia, that they don't want to be fighting in Europe and the Middle East. They want to be
Right.
ready to fight in Asia.
Yeah,
but if you look at that from a fuel perspective, like we have dedicated fuel supplies throughout Europe, in Central European pipeline network, physically, because your NATO allies are physically they're neighbors to each other, so you have ways of swapping and sharing fuel supplies. If the U.S. has to fight a war in Asia, it doesn't have dedicated fuel supplies, and where it does have partners with fuel supplies that they would provide to the United States, those countries are islands and they're not connected to each other, so they really couldn't act on behalf of each other. You would need a lot more backup. So probably the only thing that can deliver would be nuclear powered ships that will have fuel on them. And so I think in future wars, if there will be wars fought in Asia by the United States, vehicles that are not, or platforms that aren't dependent on fuel, will actually also have to deliver the electricity and the fuel for the other participants. Something to think about is that civilian nuclear capacity in the West is flat and declining. In China and Russia and in their spheres of influence, it's growing. So we might have a shortage of trained personnel in the future for these sectors, and that's going to be a problem affecting the U.S. military as well. I think another thing to think about is that we always love policymakers, you said wonks, policymakers, think tankers, journalists, they love something that hasn't been invented. So, what are we going to do about, if today's renewables can't provide enough energy, we'll use hydrogen. Well, we don't know how much hydrogen really costs to produce. We don't know if it's safe. We don't know if it can actually use the infrastructure, existing infrastructure, but it sounds kind of cool, kind of futuristic, hydrogen. So I think we have a little bit of this going on with SMRs, with small modular nuclear reactors.
Yeah.
It could be something great, but we haven't even built one of them in the West. So therefore, we don't know how they work. We don't know how much they cost. And I bet this whole modular aspect is not as modular as it seems. At every different location's probably going to have a bit more specifics, but we have to be very careful not to count on something that hasn't been invented yet.
Exactly. It's like General Myers used to say when I worked for him on the Joint Staff, wing walking in the flying circus. You better make sure that you still got a grip on that one strut before you reach out for the next. But the molten salt reactors and small modular reactors, very interesting. We've got an edited volume, a book on commercial maritime and the merchant marine coming out. One of the chapters is on SMRs. So low pressure, low temperature, not as much of a risk of an accident like a Chernobyl or a 3 Mile Island. Can be refueled on station, which is very interesting. And, as far as power density goes, it's going to make steam and it's going to turn a turbine that's probably an electric drive, but really interesting concept. And your answer was so good, I can tell you, because I interviewed with Admiral Hyman G. Rickover. If he was here right now, he'd give you a big hug. And he didn't give hugs to many people. So thank you. So on to the first question. So Brenda, I've reviewed your book, Operational Energy. It's a pioneering text. And again, right here, and your co-authors, Alan Howard and Daniel Nussbaum, just you guys did an excellent job. Um, I understand the significance of resource security in war. I actually wrote the foreword for a book called Oil and War, which the Marine Corps University brought back from being out of print. Got a copy right here, and if anybody's interested, they can get a free download of the PDF from Marine Corps University Press. Just Google Marine Corps University Press and the title of the book, Oil and War, and it should come up for you. And my hat's off to them for doing this because the full title, Oil and War, How the Deadly Struggle for Fuel in World War II Meant Victory or Defeat, was written by two guys, Robert Goralski and Russell Friedberg. Goralski was an NBC News correspondent who served with the Navy in the Pacific in World War II, and Friedberg served in the European theater with the United States Army and later became a bureau chief, the Washington bureau chief of the Chicago Tribune. So the book's extremely well researched and written in a style that appeals to historians, researchers, and warfighters alike. It begins with interwar Germany's evolutionary recovery from a near-failed state in the First World War, a disastrous economy, massive inflation, and it migrates to a nation determined to punish the Western powers that exacted this war reparation from them at the Treaty of Versailles and placed restrictions on Germany's economic resurgence and remilitarization. Adolf Hitler and his Nazi regime focused on expanding Germany's span of control in Eastern Europe before moving against France, the United States, North Africa, and finally the Soviet Union. The reason was because of oil and gas. Throughout these campaigns, the leaders of the German General Staff and the military-industrial complex knew they could not accomplish all of Hitler's objectives in the rest of Europe without significantly greater reserves of fuel. And Hitler used to say, he always criticized his generals. He would say, they don't know anything about economics. So we're going into the Caucasus first, and then we're going to take over the rest of Europe. Similarly, same time, 1937 to 1941, Japan's goal of hegemony in the Asia-Pacific theater required enormous amounts of oil and gas. And once the United States restricted the flow of oil to Japan in an attempted embargo, the path to war was inevitable. Now back to your book. Operational Energy is a must-read for energy security practitioners in both in the active duty and retired military personnel. I can understand why this book is a desired textbook at war colleges and naval postgraduate school because it's so well done. So as we say in the Navy, bravo Zulu to you and your authors. Now, in Operational Energy, you begin with a declaration that energy is an enabler. I heartily agree. You also quote a friend of mine, General John Allen, United States Marine Corps, in the book, who says operational energy, I quote, operational energy in the battle space is about improving combat effectiveness. It's about increasing our forces' endurance, being more lethal, and reducing the number of men and women risking their lives moving fuel. I couldn't agree more. Operational energy has a role in every domain of warfare, whether it's land, sea, air, cyber, or space. It can also be a vulnerability or a major constraint for both allies and adversaries. In fact, you point out vulnerabilities in our energy supply chains due to cyber attacks like the one that occurred on the Colonial Pipeline in America here a couple of years ago. Another sobering statistic in your book concerns the rise of operational energy needs in warfighting. Now, this one kind of blew me away. To ensure victory in World War II, it required about a gallon of fuel per combatant, individual soldier or sailor. Today, that number is 10 to 15 gallons per person. And as you told me in our prequel, the military depends on about 85% of its military operations powered by oil or gas. So with that said, and here's the question, how do you see energy challenges in military operations evolving in the coming years? And what are some of the most pressing issues that defense planners should be thinking about? Over to you.
Okay. So as we discussed, operational energy, the concept has two aspects. Military planners and strategists need to think about how to provide energy for their troops, for their missions, and they also need to disrupt energy supplies to their adversaries in war. I would say on the first, the U.S. does an excellent job, and is really, I think, something that's happened from about 2012, 2016 progressively. Instead of energy being a part of logistics, it's actually been moved up to its own domain, and really something that they're encouraging, I would say, from DOD, from Congress, from civil, from the executive, but various commanders of the military have been thinking about how not just to have enough, but how to have it in a way that we can fly more and farther, or sail faster and farther, without thinking about energy. And I think that's very successful. I think we need to be thinking more about one, how to disrupt to our enemies. So I think that's like each domain is very different, and it requires constant intelligence and analysis to understand where their fuel is, how they get it, where are their vulnerabilities, and also U.S. adversaries are openly articulating that they're going to disrupt our supplies during combat. They're very open about it because, let's say, both, I would say, Russia, China, and Iran all see themselves as being there's an asymmetric situation with the United States in terms of power, and that their best bet is to disrupt logistics. And what are the best logistics to disrupt? There is energy. And in fact, what they talk about, and we go into this in the book in Operational Energy, we talk about how Russia, where we analyze how Russia, China, and Iran view the American vulnerability in war and energy. And one of the domains they're looking at is the domestic domain as well. So it's not going to stay just in, if the U.S. is in the Middle East, or if the U.S. is in Asia, it doesn't mean that someone sitting in San Francisco or Pittsburgh doesn't have to worry about the safety of their energy infrastructure. Really, we're hybrid warfare. It's common now in general nowadays, but also our U.S. adversaries are definitely preparing for hybrid warfare. So we need to think, we've seen this in the United States, whether it was the Colonial Pipeline, whether it was other electricity disruption in the United States, we are vulnerable to cyber attacks. And with the current administration trying to put more and more and more on electricity, and less diversified domestic electricity system, we're actually going to become more and more vulnerable to disruptions and to cyber attacks. Also, in terms of the second side of energy security that I said, like not just supplying energy for your own operations, but disrupting to your enemies. In the last two wars that U.S. partners have been involved in, the U.S. has really restrained those countries from disrupting energy supplies to their adversaries. So, for instance, the U.S. supports Ukraine in its defense against Russia, but pretty much holds back Ukraine from disrupting Russian energy supplies. Maybe now that the global oil market is a bit more well supplied, the administration seems a little looser on that policy, but basically there was fear that if you attack Russian refineries, then in general, oil supplies aren't going to arrive to the global market, and this would cause a price spike. So there's been somewhat of holding Ukraine back. In the case of the Israel-Gaza war, not only does the U.S. expect Israel not to disrupt supplies to Hamas, but actually to provide them. So Israel has been providing fuel for close to a year essentially to Hamas, because they control all of the aid that's coming into the Gaza Strip. So essentially, the terror tunnels, they're being run, the oxygen going to them is being run by fuel provided by Israel. So so this is sort of the situation. Could you imagine in World War II, you're trying to run your operations and hearing, okay, make sure that the people of Dresden are receiving fuel while you're fighting the war with the German army. So that's right. The situation today. I think another problem is that the wider public, the largest consumer of energy, single consumer of energy in the United States and globally is the U.S. military. And so a lot of people, when they want to push or prod an energy transition to renewable energy, they say, well, let's just get the Navy on the Great Green Fleet. Let's get the military off of fossil fuels, and then everything will move around it, because this is the biggest consumer. And relatively, it's true. Militaries they can make changes that maybe other commercial organizations can't make. But actually, the military is probably the last place that will ever be able to give, barring some sort of very big technological change. The military is probably the last institution that will ever be able to leave fossil fuels and nuclear energy, simply because energy density, and I think we could talk about this a bit. We can maybe talk a little bit more about this concept. But energy density, it's a little wonky here, but it is one of my favorite phrases. Energy density means the mass and weight per unit of energy. So different for our audience, different sources of energy have different density. It's kind of like, how many cups do you need to hold the same amount of energy? And let's say solar and wind are very low density, where uranium and petroleum-based fuels are very high density. So in a very small and not heavy space, you can hold more energy. This is relevant for price for anything. Like, for instance, if you're just gonna distribute Coca-Cola bottles in a city, how much fuel your truck needs will depend on the density, the weight of the bottles. But when you're flying a ship, when you're flying a plane or you're running a ship, if your fuel is heavier because it's not dense, this means you're going to have to take off some combatants or some ammunition or other supplies. So probably the last places that could ever go to non-dense fuels are the Air Force and the Navy.
Wow, that's a pretty deep answer. We'll talk a little bit more about energy density and electrification of the battlefield, but just a couple comments on your last narrative. I heard you say that energy has become, in and of itself, under the rubric of logistics, a domain. And I could not agree with you more. I mean, I did a big exercise before I retired called Trident Juncture 2018. We had 50,000 soldiers, sailors, airmen, and Marines, and 265 aircraft from all over NATO, 70 ships, big ones, carriers, strike groups, and 10,000 tanks and rolling vehicles. And the biggest challenge was logistics. And having forward operating bases with fuel bladders that could refill these tracked vehicles, but also helicopters that were moving all over the country of Norway. So fully subscribe to that, and you'll hear me say sixth domain a lot. And then I think you're absolutely right. Lost in the narrative, is we have restricted Ukraine from going after energy infrastructure, even though the Russians have taken a toll on the power grid and also fuel locations and depots in Ukraine. We should let them defend themselves and also go after the center of gravity in Russia, in my humble opinion. I'm with General Ben Hodges on this, so thank you for mentioning that. I want to talk a little bit about the axis of upheaval before we get back to energy density. So we're seeing an era of significant global instability driven by geopolitical realignments and rising authoritarianism. I did 40 years in the service, Brenda, and I've been retired now for 4 years, and I have never seen the United States or our allies surrounded by so many adversaries since the end of the Cold War, and it's frightening. So this new axis of upheaval has emerged comprising Russia, China, Iran, and North Korea. And that is a volatile cocktail of ingredients. And this bloc is increasingly cooperating with one another and terrorist organizations against the free world. So in your view, how is the axis of upheaval reshaping the global energy landscape? What roles do energy-rich nations like Russia and Iran play in destabilizing the international system? And how do they leverage energy as a tool of statecraft? Frankly, I think they're selling their oil and gas to China, a country with an insatiable desire for operational energy to feed their economy. And I would ask, we talked about your book and Oil and War by Goralski and Friedberg. Do you see a parallel here between China today and Imperial Japan from 1937 to 1941 with this great thirst for oil to take over the world? And if so, what can we do and what should we do about this increasingly dangerous energy collaboration between Russia, China, Iran, and North Korea? Can we do anything? Over to you.
Okay, so first thing, Jamie, I'm very happy you're discussing this emerging alliance because I think that too many people are underestimating this development. So we've been quite, I don't know, lucky or skillful that since World War II, basically the U.S. has had security dominance, and no other country, whether it's China, the USSR, and then Russia, Iran, North Korea, no country on its own could present any sort of serious security threat to the United States. Could hit you here and there, but the United States eventually could be dominant. But they're working together, which was almost something impossible to imagine. Let's remember, we're old enough to remember the Sino-Soviet conflict,
right?
200 years of Russian-Iranian empire having wars, right? So to imagine that China, Russia, Iran, and North Korea would actually become allies, not just have some cooperation, is pretty amazing. And I think it's very dangerous because they're managing to fulfill the problems and each other's weaknesses. Like let's say, for instance, China is energy poor, so they have Russia and Iran. Some types of military components that North Korea is really good with their science at innovating, and then Iran is really fast at manufacturing it. They're very good at suddenly getting some kind of template and turning it into a weapon. Russia's been very good with things like bullets and guns and helmets, sort of the ground forces, what they need, and Iran can come through with drones and missiles and rockets. So I think the United States is facing a very big threat, and we just kind of go along our way, enjoying our time. Very few people. I haven't heard one question to either presidential candidate about this newfound alliance, and then you still hear Americans, again, across the political spectrum. I don't even think this is a Republican or Democrat problem. Talk about the rules-based international order, the liberal international order. Well, I don't know what, it's hardly for the U.S. and its allies, but there is this other world that completely does not accept whether the U.S. views as the rules of the game or views as the order. We don't have enough thinking about that.
Yeah.
So I think first thing, energy was a very big glue in this alliance. In a certain sense, we helped put this alliance together. It wasn't just that, we all have problems with the United States, so let's work together. That was part of it. The other part was, and again, I'm not against these policies, but you have to look at the consequences. With only primary oil sanctions on Iran and Russia, not secondary, meaning they can, you only try to stop their exports, but you don't punish someone else who buys them. We set it up for China to receive cheap oil, right? So here, Russia and Iran needed a market. China happy to get cheap oil. So what are you doing? You're giving to your main adversary cheaper oil, meaning you're helping their economy. You're giving them a competitive edge with the West. And for Russia and Iran, you're blunting your own sanctions because they got a market. Sure, they're selling it cheaper, but they're still making enough. So oil is a big part of the glue here. A second thing is that we're going on in the West, the US and Europe and our allies in Asia and Asia Pacific. We're going on with a very, very serious policies on a so-called energy transition, and which have huge, these policies that we're following, but Russia, China, Iran, North Korea aren't, are leading us to have more expensive and less reliable electricity, while our adversaries continue with cheap and reliable electricity. In the case of China and North Korea, mostly based on coal. In the case of Russia and Iran, mostly Russia nuclear and natural gas. Iran mostly natural gas. So we're giving it also a manufacturing advantage to our adversaries by them having cheaper along the road, down the line, cheaper electricity. But also this idea of disruptions. If you have unstable electricity, and then fast forward to what we talked about before about the homeland domain, hybrid warfare being brought into a conflict, right? So we're going to have less reliable electricity, more expensive electricity if we introduce more and more renewable energy, today's renewable, while our adversaries are going to have more reliable and cheaper electricity. We're spending a lot of money. Under the Biden administration, it was close to $1 trillion. Secretary of Treasury Janet Yellen says the world needs $3 trillion a year of investment in new energy in order to make a transition. So basically, we're paying to replicate something we already have, right? So it's sort of like you have a car that works, it's fine, but you say instead you're going to build another car that's more expensive, and it'll get you around, but you've basically just duplicated what you had. But at the same time, our adversaries, they're not reducing emissions, they're not changing their economies, and basically all the sacrifices U.S. and Europe are going to do on climate are going to be moot if it's not a global effort. Just take one example. There's a huge emphasis right now of the climate organizations, of the United Nations, that we have to stop using natural gas, right? That some way natural gas was the main source of electricity in the United States. Somehow we have to stop using this because of methane emissions, another greenhouse gas. Methane emissions from natural gas are 4% of the overall methane emissions. 10% of global methane emissions are from, want to take a guess?
From
rice. Sorry?
Really? Rice?
Rice cultivation. Okay.
Okay.
So China is the leading producer of methane in the world. Do you ever see those activists that are standing in front of power plants on freeways? Just stop rice. But it sounds almost ridiculous. Like, well, why would you ask China to stop cultivating rice? Right? That would be ridiculous, right? People would starve. People need to eat, right? But it's just as ridiculous to ask the United States to stop producing electricity, or anywhere in the world, and also from natural gas, from a source that doesn't pollute. So there is definitely an imbalance in how the world treats China's emissions and pollution, and the way it treats that of the United States. This moving away from cheap or at least affordable electricity, we could see what can happen to the United States by looking at Germany. Germany is basically deindustrializing. It used to be among the top 10, then the top 20 industrial powers, just moved out of the 20. You're seeing German energy intensive industries either collapse or migrate to the United States, which isn't bad for the United States, but they're moving to the United States because of cheap energy, which is the main input in manufacturing. And those industries will never go back. If you look at our national security strategy, or if you look at our national defense doctrines, they hardly mention energy security. They hardly mention operational energy. When they discuss energy security, it's almost always in the context of clean energy, renewable energy, not the energy that we, the American public or the US military, use. So you might want to have an energy transition, but you still should have a strategy about how you get the energy that's in use today. And if I look at the national security strategy, it mentions clean energy more than it mentions Russia or Iran in the whole doctrine. I want to say also a thing, think about, for most of the 20th century and early 21st century, you could count on the US to ensure freedom of navigation. This was your job for 40 years. But I would think that not only was the US Navy providing freedom of navigation to the world, even US adversaries were happy for the US to have this job. And this allowed it, like, for instance, because the US was keeping, let's say, the Straits of Malacca open and secure, I think China was much more comfortable with the U.S. Navy, kind of in a close area because they realized there was a benefit from it. Well, think from 2019, the Red Sea has been disrupted by
Exactly.
Houthis, not high tech, not really high tech force.
Right.
They don't have anything that can directly threaten the United States, and yet we've been so afraid that we might offend Iran that the U.S. Navy is not, or I would say the U.S. Navy because this is a decision from the political level, but the United States has not directed its Navy to keep that waterway open. That's added 2 to 3% to global inflation. I mean, just by all that extra shipping. And that's also a threat to our global energy security. LNG exports now have to take a lot longer route. Oil exports, oil trade, LNG trade. So right now it's tolerable in markets that are relatively liquid and well fueled. But in another scenario, could be very dangerous that these waterways are essentially closed.
Well, Brenda, yeah, just let me talk about that last point first, and then I have a couple of other comments. Fascinating discussion, by the way. And we're doing a 1-year anniversary event here of the crisis in the Red Sea on the 3rd of October, of course, the 7th being the attack. And then shortly thereafter, on the 19th of October, USS Carney fired its first missile against Houthi missiles that were headed to Israel. And we've been in there the entire time. So the U.S. Navy has been directed to keep the sea lines of communication open, but frankly, we have not in the Red Sea. Some ships have gotten through. The ones that seem to have a buy or get a pass are COSCO ships, China Ocean Shipping Company, and Russian ships because they're collaborating with the Houthis. And, that it turns my stomach, frankly. If you want to be a great power, then take responsibility for what's going on in international waterways in the world. But the U.S. Navy has tried hard, but I think it's been limited in its ability to strike targets deep in Yemen. But moreover, the supply chain and the supply lines, like you pointed out, are coming from Iran. And we're going to have to deal with that before we can restore the traffic to normal levels in the Red Sea. Also, back to your point about Germany and deindustrialization. I was born in Rheindahlen at NATO Northern Army headquarters. My father was stationed as a major in the 1960s. And I grew up with a deep respect for Germany. It reindustrialized and rebuilt itself after World War II. But subsequently, governments have come in and the Green Movement has manifested itself. And Chancellor Merkel made the decision to shut down her nuclear power plants to appease a minority party. What that's done is that's raised energy prices in Germany. And who benefits from this more than anybody else? France, because France has embraced nuclear power. They're selling a lot of they've got excess energy in France. They got everything they need, and they sell their excess at a pretty good profit to the Germans and probably to the Spanish as well. So really good points. Now, you've touched on my next two-part question, but I think there's other things you may want to say. So these two parts kind of go hand in glove. One of your favorite subjects on operational energy, and I think you and your co-authors coined or associated this term with OE, and that is energy density, power density. It's important for military machines to have an effective power source like JP5 or diesel or nuclear power, which is essentially will operate in perpetuity until you run out the core after 15 years of operation, and then you refuel. So energy density is a very keen factor in the success of naval operations, particularly in terms of endurance. And so if you want to say anything more on that, and power projection of military forces across, we talked about the pivot to the Pacific. We like to refer to the tyranny of distance across the Pacific. I'm an Atlantic Fleet sailor. I was a Cold War sailor, and my contemporaries out in the Pacific used to tell me, hey, Jamie, you operate in a pond. we operate in a real ocean and a real big ocean. So tyranny of distance across the Pacific really dictates that we embrace those high energy, high density fuels. The second point is about energy transitions. And I know you're passionate about this, and you opened my eyes in our prequel to a lot of things. You know, in the book, Operational Energy, you talk about energy transitions, 19th, 20th, 21st century, where we evolved from wood-fired systems that created energy that could be harnessed to coal-fired burners and boilers to fossil fuels in the beginning of the 20th century, culminating in nuclear power. And by the way, you and your authors mentioned Admiral Rickover in the book, and that's terrific. I don't think we could reinvent the nuclear power program today if we started from scratch. And that guy was the iconic leader of the program that marinized nuclear propulsion and put it on submarines in 1954 on USS Nautilus. We came into the 20th century, 21st century transition, and we, for a while, embraced the Great Green Fleet, organic fuels. And we actually had some platforms operating on these corn-fed fuels. We even flew an F-18 aircraft, but it was very expensive. It was probably 5 times or more the price of a gallon of JP5. In the book, and I love this quote, you said, first, the military needs fuels that pack a lot of energy per unit in weight and mass. Not only does the fuel have to generate enough power to propel a tank, a plane, or a naval vessel, often substantial distances, it must easily be transportable in a constrained space. Today, only petroleum-derived and nuclear fuels can provide the needed energy density. Batteries, for instance, pack less energy per pound and inch than these fuels. Biofuels are also less energy dense than petroleum derivatives. So your last point on energy density is an important concept, and some policy wonks just don't understand it. You've enlightened us a little bit today. Is there anything else you'd like to say about energy density, energy transitions, and where we're going?
Right. So as you pointed out, that energy needs for the military are very different than the civilian sector. Civilian sectors are built actually to endure some blackouts, meaning that you don't want to keep, more than 90, 100% capacity. There'll be some peak energy needs. And so energy will have to go off for a couple hours in a few places. That's much more efficient than, keeping over capacity available. The military, it's exactly the opposite. When you have peak demand is actually when you can't fail. It's the time that you absolutely have to have your energy. So you have to work at a lot higher margins of energy, security, backup, redundancy. Second, as you pointed out, a tyranny of distance, right? But I'm thinking of the tyranny of multiple theaters. I mean, can't we easily imagine, without really needing to be futuristic, that the US is going to have to be present in the Middle East, Asia, and Europe at the same time? As I said before, and the home front because of hybrid warfare. So all that, the energy infrastructure is going to be brought in. So we need very reliable energy that you can move around quickly, that's diversified if we're going to have multi-front wars. It is kind of funny how when you hear policymakers talk about energy, so let's say they want to have electrification of the battlefield. So they say, well, what could be better than a microgrid, that isn't dependent on these long supply lines from the United States, to get, look how difficult it was to get fuel into Afghanistan. And indeed, it was difficult, right? But, well, what are you running that microgrid on? Where is that electricity coming from? Are you going to be dependent on the local country where your military is deployed for that electricity? Are you, even in friendly countries, let's not talk about countries that we've deployed in a military operation without their agreement. Civilian supply lines are, most of the military today, its energy supplies run on civilian supply lines. Those are much more vulnerable than military supply lines. Think about some guy that sells propane in the Philippines. What's the level of his cyber security? Or someone selling electricity grid in Thailand. What's their level of cyber security? So these supply lines that the U.S. military uses, civilian ones, are much more vulnerable than, let's say, the military supply lines themselves. So we need to think about that. I remember also one of the graduation ceremonies of the Marine University, American policymaker, I won't mention which one, but mentioned, wouldn't a Marine rather carry a solar panel than all those batteries? No, the Marine would actually rather carry all those batteries, because those batteries are what's going to operate. They're going to operate a lot more time than the volatility of a solar panel with all the electricity they're packed with. I would add one more thing to energy density that maybe it's not connected so much to the military, but we use the terms clean energy, renewable energy, green energy as if they're the same thing. We throw them around, replace them. They're actually three very different things. Clean energy refers to low carbon energy. Renewable energy is energy that its use doesn't deplete, and green energy is energy which has low environmental impact. But actually, because let's say solar and wind use so much land, right? We talked about density in order to produce energy, a lot more than, let's say, certainly the nuclear power, the natural gas power plants. They actually have a huge green impact or anti-green impact in that they use a lot of land. What's land? That's what we, AKA nature, right? Open spaces, something where you don't build. If you cover stuff with solar panels and wind towers, you're taking up a lot of nature. So it's not even clear how much, not only are they not dense in what they produce, but they're not dense in terms of the land usage.
Great discussion. Thank you. I never really thought about that. When you think about a picture of wind farms out in California, or solar panels and a solar farm out in California, it goes on for acres and acres and acres. And could that land be used for something else? Plus, generating heat. So, obviously there's an impact there on climate and environment, and there's probably a trade-off there too, based on heat generation from other fossil fuel sources. And I won't profess to be any kind of an expert, but a novice on that. The same thing for wind. As you look at wind power, the towers and the windmills over Europe, they go on for miles and miles in several cases, and sometimes offshore. So could those spaces be used for something else? And, you bring up a really good point about electrification of the battlefield and the fact that, everything is going to run off batteries or electricity, and the grid is vulnerable. I am neither a fan nor a critic, because I don't know enough about this moniker replicator. We talk about replicator being a hellscape of 1,000 drones. And I've talked to folks both in the Pentagon and outside the Pentagon about that, and say, well, Ukraine has been very successful at launching drones far inland in Russia. They've also launched sea drones from outside of the Sea of Azov and Crimea and into even lakes, Lake Donbass in Crimea, and attacked a Russian corvette successfully. So they do have range. But when I think about replicator and electric powered drones, where do you launch them from? How close do you have to get? And I don't know the answers to those questions. I hope somebody is working on them. And I wish somebody would talk about that, because that leads to speculation and potentially more pundits and critics. Let me move to a different subject. And from my experience in maritime security and in global energy routes, I am acutely aware of the vulnerabilities of our energy infrastructure from state and non-state actors, particularly critical undersea infrastructure, a hot topic nowadays, particularly with the sabotage of the Nord Stream 2 pipeline. Jury's still out, who done it. And I don't necessarily want to talk about that, but the Baltic Sea undersea cable network, we think we know that was a Chinese ship that drug an anchor across that network, either by accident or on purpose. Jury is still out there. But Brenda, you've highlighted the risks to energy infrastructure in your work. What are the biggest threats facing global energy infrastructure today, and how can countries better protect these critical assets, especially in an era of increasing cyber and hybrid warfare threats?
Okay. So first thing, a lot of the critical infrastructure, not just energy infrastructure, but critical infrastructure is owned by private entities and maintained by private entities. So the interface between governments and the need to protect critical infrastructure, that constantly needs to be worked on. And many of these pieces of infrastructure are not close to any, EEZ, any exclusive economic zone. So, they're in the open seas. So it is really a question, which governments have the right even to defend, these pieces of infrastructure. Second, we need to study, and they're pretty open about it, or at least there's a lot of open information about this, China, Russia, and Iran, their intentions for disrupting this infrastructure. So, read some studies, some very good studies looking at this. And again, in their doctrine, sometimes they don't specifically say energy, but they say supply lines or critical infrastructure. But later they'll say energy is, one of the most important infrastructure fields that should be targeted. I think we need to bake into our domestic U.S. domestic energy infrastructure security a lot more of the implications for the Department of Defense, for the U.S. military, because so much more of our warfare is being fought from the United States, right? So you might be sitting in a base in Colorado and operating a drone or an electric fence that's in Afghanistan or in Iraq or somewhere else. And then also, as I said, our adversaries are looking to disrupt our domestic infrastructure as a way of disrupting our the U.S. military force. As James Cayley said, he's quoted in this book, who heads operational energy in the U.S. Navy. He said that the best way to get a plane, a U.S. military plane out of operation, is actually to cut the electricity to the base where it's fueling, right? And then it's not going to take off. So I think our adversaries, our enemies, are thinking about these kind of vulnerabilities all the time. We need to read what they're doing. And we need to be, again, there's these fads, whether it's hydrogen or, take something like hydrogen, extremely flammable. The chance that we really want on planes and ships a highly flammable material to, petroleum is flammable enough, gasoline, diesel are flammable enough, right? But something that's even more flammable is quite questionable. And all the problems with electrification of the battlefield, especially cyber attacks, vulnerability. So we need to be very careful between wishful thinking and strategic thinking. And one thing, we hear all the time from policymakers, defense officials, we're in an energy transition, and how does the military respond to the energy transition? But the reality is we're not in an energy transition. In 1975, 85% of the global fuel needs were met by fossil fuels. Today, it's 81.5. So we've put in trillions, literally trillions of dollars and euros in subsidies to move the dial 3.5% in renewable energy. And it's not necessarily linear. I think there's a problem sometimes with people's thinking. They think, well, it moved 3%, then it can move 6%, it can move 12%. No, technologies often hit a wall, and can't necessarily continue to scale up. 2023, we had record demand for coal, natural gas, and oil. So you'll hear people talking about, this much of increase in solar panels, this increase in wind, but they didn't tell you the other half, that there's been just as much an increase, if not more, almost more, with coal, oil, and natural gas. And we're actually sort of something that's very sad for me to point out, that 2022 was our first year that we had reversal globally in the amount of people that have access to electricity in the world. We've always, from the beginning of the use of electricity, it's been growing. And what that means, I frequently talk with different student groups, different groups about, have you ever been to a place that doesn't have electricity? And they've been in places that have had blackouts, but brownouts, blackouts, disruptions, but rarely have people been to places that don't have electricity. I have. I'm a freak. I love to travel to East African countries, and I've stayed in many places where people don't have electricity. And people, if you don't allow them access to energy, it doesn't mean they're going to, okay, if I can't have natural gas or nuclear, then I'm going to use renewables. It means they're going to be burning wood, dung, and other biomass. And this is the most polluting, this is the highest carbon emissions, and this is the biggest threat to human health around the world, which is indoor pollution. And the United States, we don't think a lot about that. So the United States in 2021, we stopped all public funding to fossil fuels. Good for us, feeling really good about ourselves. And what that means is someone in Tanzania, instead of having clean power from a gas-fired power plant, will continue to have smoke in their hut, or their small house. And so I don't think we should have such a feel-good moment about that.
No, that's fascinating. And it was probably 10 years ago, 2013 to 2014. I was doing shuttle diplomacy back and forth to China on an agreement that we struck with the PLA Navy called Rules of Behavior in the Maritime Domain. But while I was out there, the U.S. naval attaché to China lived in a compound that was outside the city of Beijing. And he drove me out there to see, where he lived. While we were driving, we went through a Chinese village, a hutang. And as you were driving through the hutang, here are these little tuk-tuks, these three-wheeled trucks, that were probably around for 20 years. It's all dilapidated. They had wooden sides on the back, and a guy is transporting big hunks of coal or shale to go burn in your hut in the hutang.
Yeah.
And the stuff is falling off the truck on the highway. He probably wished he knew that, because that was probably 20 renminbi worth of coil that fell off the truck. But I just imagine, and the attaché told me, they burn that in their houses, and there's a big carbon footprint there. And I don't think it's gotten any better, because the smog and pollution in Beijing was terrible at the time.
Right.
On this critical undersea infrastructure, whether it's a pipeline carrying oil or gas, or whether it's cables, and $1 trillion worth of market information passes across the Atlantic. You remember the Atlantic Council every day. We've got to protect it. NATO woke up to this after Nord Stream 2, and Secretary General Jens Stoltenberg named General Naumann, who's a German officer, to do a 1-year study on how to protect undersea critical infrastructure. We need to do a lot more. He's a fellow NATO mentor. I've heard him speak. I've heard his presentation. It's excellent. And I think as an alliance of nations, we all need to take this more seriously and protect it. Wow, great conversation today. And last question for you that kind of deals with the subject of open source information in today's battle space. So we talked in the prequel of the podcast about the recent drop in oil gas prices, really less than $3 a gallon in some states, helping us to avoid a recession, keep the voters happy, soft landing after 2 years. Some consumers still see doom and gloom on the horizon. And my question is, our sponsor creates an environment where it offers open source information. And like I said, I used First Alert Dataminr when I was on active duty, and I get it today on my cell phone. It tells me what's going on in the world in any place I want to look. So do you think accurate open source information can play a role in clearing up some of these myths about energy or the economy, and providing our viewers with more clarity on the politics of energy? Over to you.
Right. So energy is actually a field where, there's probably very little comparative advantage to intelligence organizations. Actually, so much of the information is out there. The people are out there that you can interview and speak with. But I think, and this is where maybe something like a more sophisticated use of open information that you're mentioning, like Dataminr versus a Google search can be useful, is that one, you need to read the original documents. Like, there's such a huge gap between, like, let's say, take the whole issue of climate. It's under the IPCC. So if you read their actual research, their reports versus the summary for policymakers versus what you get in the media, it's three completely different things. You have to read the information itself. Or if anyone, I think almost every day I read Bloomberg, New York Times, Washington Post, you just want to almost laugh about how they report about climate and energy. And especially like nowadays, most mainstream media sources have embedded, let's say, so-called climate journalists they're paid for by outside foundations or by donors. So let's say Associated Press has a whole section on climate. Most things, they're one of the leaders of publishing information about climate, but the people who work there they're not AP journalists. They're people that they're being paid for by an outside foundation. So obviously they're never going to criticize anything about climate data or anything mainstream idea, because their job is actually to promote the mainstream idea. So definitely the open source information can be extremely valuable, but it's important that it comes through sort of an independent and non-biased lens. Take another example. About 2-3 years ago, deputy spokeswoman of the United Nations, Melissa Fleming, she was talking about misinformation, disinformation at a World Economic Forum panel. And she said, take the issue of climate. We noticed that in Google searches that our meaning the United Nations, our reports weren't coming up first. So we partnered with Google, meaning, we colluded with Google to make sure that United Nations publications come up in the first 10, 20, 30 searches. So there's no, debate in a sense. And she used the phrase, and this isn't still up on the United Nations website, like they're not even embarrassed by this, but we own the science and we want the world to know it. This is the United Nations. This is a political organization. This isn't a university or a national laboratory. I mean, I don't even think, a national laboratory would say we own the science, would be that, arrogant. But certainly a political organization, political and politicized organization like the United Nations should never even get near the science, let alone to own it. But I actually do agree that they succeed to own it because of this power that they have over our access to information. So again, something that can harness open source information, but prevent balance and debates, I think it's definitely something that we're in need of.
Well, I think that's Dataminr First Alert in a nutshell. First of all, it's an algorithm that searches multiple sources, primarily social media, and it looks around the world for a clump of events happening in any given geographic spot and says, hey, something's going on there. And then it goes and analyzes a photo, a tweet, or an X, or something that's reported in social media, and it builds over time. And they've added this new system called regenerative AI, Regen AI, so it can kind of carry this narrative. But this is a machine reporting that is completely apolitical. And so when you get the information, you decide for yourself, and that's the beauty of a democracy in a free country. This information is available to you. You decide for yourself, and you make judgments based on the information you receive. By the way, they're feeding all the major news services. And when I was overseas, my J2, my intel officer, get mad at me because I'd say, hey, these guys are faster than you are, so we need to, because of the vetting of real-time intelligence, it has to go through a vetting process. But Professor Brenda Shaffer, this has been fantastic. What an incredible narrative. What an incredible life you've had as a researcher and academician, and what a great personality and charisma you have to come on the show. Thank you so much.
Jamie.
Folks, that's a wrap. I'd like to thank Professor Shaffer for taking the time, especially doing this from an overseas location, to be with Maritime Nation and our listeners today. I'd like to thank our listeners for joining us each month. I'd also like to give a shout out to Admiral Steve Moss, who's an old friend of mine. He was very senior to me when I was in the Navy, logistician, supply corps, served with the submarine force. And Steve listens to our podcast and invariably always provides me with great feedback. So Steve, thanks. And keep that feedback coming. We'd love to hear what you have to say about today's podcast. Ladies and gents, if you have not heard our previous episodes, you can always catch up on Spotify and Apple Podcasts. Episodes and all content described here today can be found on our website at www.centerformaritimestrategy.org. Thanks to Dataminr and our sound engineer, James Peterson, for the sponsorship and support. Stay tuned for the next episode of Maritime Nation. That's all out here. Thank you.